Well, I want to say thank you to the other speakers who have come before me. I feel really honored to be in their company. When I read our biographies online, I was like, wow, I need to put up a little bit more about I am educated to some extent, besides just being through the School of Life. As Yusuf talked to us originally, he said things start with an idea. And even this TED event had to start with an idea. But that was followed up by a lot of human effort. And being able to work out your interpersonal relationships in groups, in organizing something like this, is something that we all need to be doing more of as life goes on. Ilana spoke to us about great places. And again, that's bringing all of us closer and closer together, where we have to relate with each other a little more closely and work together a little more closely. And Paul's story is a very personal story. But he's talking about it because at some point along the way, he recognized that his human story can also touch other human beings, because that's what we all are here. My story is a little bit similar to his. I think at one point in my life, fairly early on, I realized I had overcome a very significant challenge. There was a story there. And I really got a sense that at some point, I would be telling that story to other people. And you are my first people to be telling this story to, as far as this size audience. So I thank you very much for being here. So let's go back to the very beginning, when I was born in 1965. My mother was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but at the time, her symptoms were not that severe or debilitating. My father, they were still married, of course. I had two sisters who were 8 years older than I was. They were twins. And there was another daughter who was born between us who had multiple birth defects. She eventually died at 18 months of cranial stenosis. So that had been a pretty traumatizing experience for my whole family before I was born. And the day I was born, my mother checked me out very carefully to make sure I didn't have any defects. And apart from having ears that didn't match and they kind of sticked out a little bit, and a very stubborn right arm that just really didn't want to be bothered, the rest was okay, just leave the right arm to me. She deemed me her perfect child, her angel. But you can imagine how that kind of affected my sisters as the years went by. And as I grew, she recognized that I was bright and even understood things maybe beyond my years. And I'm afraid that intuition and giftedness may have been what led her to believe, ultimately, that we were both prophets sent here to save the world from drugs, prostitution, and witchcraft that had been infiltrated here by the communists. That's right. That was our story. That was our destiny together, and no small task for a little kid to live up to, let me tell you. Of course, that particular illusion led to some others, like the forces of darkness being out to stop us. And initially, those forces of darkness included the mafia. And then they included my father, who was a long-haul truck driver, and I think she figured somewhere along the way he hooked up with the mafia. Again, you got to keep in mind, this is her mental illness that's expressing itself in our lives. Eventually, the other side included pretty much anyone my mother objected to, anyone who did not believe our story. So by the time I was 7 years old, she divorced my father, was able to convince the courts to file a restraining order against him, and that left me and my two sisters and her alone. But she was convinced that my father was out to kill us. Now, we would sleep together in one room with a dresser pushed across the door as a barricade. And this was a real challenge for me because she said our father loved us, but that he wanted to kill us. So you can imagine the kind of approach avoidance conflicts I later had with men in my life based on that experience. My sisters, as I said, were 8 years older than I was when I was born. And so there weren't too many years there that we were all together after the divorce before they went on to college. And unfortunately, shortly after that, my mom cut off contact with them as well. So that left me, from the age of about 10 on, alone with my mother. And for the next 10 years or so, her condition progressively worsened. And I had to become more and more responsible for mediating between us inside, behind closed doors, and the outside world. I still went to school, but every time I walked out the door, because of my mom's fears that I took on as normal for me as well, I thought I could get my head blown off at any point. There were times when, depending on where we were living, one particular situation, where I would dress up in baggy pants and a jacket, and I would put my hair up in a ball cap so I would look like a boy, and I would steal away in the early hours of the morning to the local grocery store to get groceries to carry back home before it was daylight so that nobody would see me except for maybe the grocery store clerk. So this was my life, day in and day out. And you might wonder why I didn't talk to anybody about it. But the fact is, it's pretty simple. My mom had me convinced that if I talked to anyone who was part of the mafia, then they would come after us. And if I talked to anyone who wasn't part of the mafia, then they would be endangered by knowing about us. So this was her way of keeping me emotionally and psychologically separated from people, even when I was not necessarily physically separated from them. Like my sisters, college or high school led to college for me, and that was when I finally started to have a little bit more freedom. By that time, my mother had qualified for Social Security disability, and she was living on her own in a house relatively close to campus. I would still have to take her groceries on a regular basis, and you have to understand, I still was afraid. You know, I still did not know that my life story was any different than what my mom had told me. Nevertheless, I started out living in the dorms, and then I started living with other students, including one who was my cousin. And we lived in, you know how, you all are students, you know how it is. You live in different houses wherever you can, all over campus. And it was when I was living in one of those houses that the police showed up at our door. And they told me my mother was in the emergency room. At first, I thought maybe she'd had a heart attack, because there had been years, all those years that we were together, she was complaining about physical ailments like blood clots or any other heart ailments. But they said, no, we just found her disoriented, wandering around outside her house. So they took me to the emergency room, and as I walked in and looked at her on the gurney, she asked me, "Who shot me?" And I didn't see anything that would warrant a question like that, so I was like, "I don't think anybody shot you." She said, "Well, you know, I heard your voice, and I heard your sister's voices, and I thought you all were dead, and I just wanted to be dead too." And I was like, "Well, I'm alive, you know, I'm not dead." And then my mom went into a fairly elaborate description of what she felt had happened to her that night. And it included a lot of symbolic language and a cast of good and evil characters that were very familiar to me because I'd grown up with all that. But a few hours later, when the minister of the church that we had recently been involved with came to visit with us, she told him that story. And for the first time in my life, I started to listen to it from a third person's point of view. And then it hit me. This must sound so bizarre. And then as all the evidence started to kind of pile on that my mom had actually tried to harm herself, possibly even kill herself, I got to thinking, you know, prophets don't try to kill themselves. So that means we're probably not prophets. And that means all these years of my life have kind of been one big lie. But more than that, I realized I had been afraid for all those years for no good reason. And I felt it was a really big waste of my life. And by golly, from that moment on, I was not going to be afraid of anything. And that's why I'm not afraid to speak in front of you right now, part of it anyway. The authorities were able to take my mom to a mental hospital at that point and commit her without my being involved because she had tried to harm herself. And I really felt that on some level I was being freed of my responsibility for my mother for the first time in my life. I still loved her, as I do now, but I also had kind of this feeling that we had some karma together, and I had done my time, and now I was being released from that relationship, and I could go on with my own life. I had many mentor teachers and counselors around me, and they supported me, and one of them gave me a copy of The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck, which I read. You seem to be familiar with it. And after reading that book and given the history with my mother, I became absolutely committed to dealing with reality as it was. And I have to say, I'm actually grateful that my mother lived an example to me of what happens to people when they don't do that. And I don't blame her for that. It was part of her mental illness. And yet it taught me something. And it made me really, really, really want to commit myself to the truth about myself, about other people, about the world. I was just, even though God and Jesus went out the window with the whole idea of being a prophet, I was still praying to the universe, bring it on. Bring on this truth and reality. I'll deal with it. So I'm grateful for having that motivation. I went through a period of transition coming out of this strange world that I'd lived to into this new world that I was kind of unfamiliar with and naive about. And about 3 years after my mom went into the mental hospital, I decided to join the carnival. They came to our campus and set up, and there was this young man there who looked a lot like Tom Cruise, and I got to be friends with him. Of course, that's not the only reason I joined the carnival, but there was a little motivation there. But I also just wanted to do it for myself. It was the first decision I made just because I wanted to do it. It wasn't to live up to any of my mother's expectations. It wasn't to live up to anybody else's expectations. And so in the summer of 1988, I joined Cumberland Valley Shows out of Lebanon, Tennessee, and started running a Shoot Out the Star joint. Maybe you all know about the air-powered BB guns. And while I was on the road, even after making this kind of crazy decision in my life, I met this guy who was a painter, and I came to know him as the Zen painter. Because he'd do these really beautiful, elaborate backdrops for the different games and the shows, and even some of the truck trailers that people lived in and traveled in while they were on the road. And he took an interest in me, and it was really one of those times when I was able to tell a stranger about my life story. And he was listening very carefully. And even though he traveled from one carnival to the next throughout the region, he gave me a book to read that I was planning on giving back to him as soon as he came back to our show. And that book was The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. I wanted to read it pretty quickly. It was a short book, under 200 pages. So I remember sitting in my room, which was like not much bigger than this. It was a chunk of the truck trailer. There'd been like 10 different rooms in the truck trailer for all the workers in the carnival. And I remember sitting on my bunk bed reading one section in this book about how your parents, this is Alice Miller speaking, your parents are the only two people in the world, or your adoptive parents or your caretakers, who are obligated to love you unconditionally. And that if you did not receive that from your parents, if you did not get to have a happy childhood, it was important to acknowledge that loss, because there was no way you're going to be able to get it back once you're an adult. And by golly, it didn't take me long to figure out how that applied to my life. And I was just right there in my room. So I mourned the loss of my happy childhood. And as Alice Miller instructed, I moved on from there. Now, it was a challenge. It was difficult, but it was also one of the most liberating experiences of my life. Because not only was I relieved from the search to get that from anybody else in my life, I also recognized that the only person left to do that for me was me. I was responsible for loving myself unconditionally, and even for parenting or reparenting myself. But it was liberating for me it was also liberating for the people I came in contact with in the future, because I did not enter into those relationships with those expectations. And that's why I'm talking to you about this in the context of how we relate interpersonally and how that affects our relationships in groups. Because if you go to an employer expecting them to love you unconditionally, there's going to be a problem there, okay? That employer is going to evaluate you based on how well you do your job. If you're in a group situation where you're expected to participate, even if you're going in there thinking you're going to hook up with somebody else who's also interested in this project, well, guess what? That's not the appropriate place for that kind of thinking and motivation. You're there to get a job done, and you have to learn to be able to work productively with other people, not carrying along this little child with you that you wish you could go back to being. But I also want to say I know other people have talked about loving yourself unconditionally, but they don't always remind you to A, remember and understand that every child, including yourself, deserves to have a peaceful, loving, unconditionally loving, and functionally supportive childhood. But if you don't get that, it's very important, as I've said, to mourn that loss. Really, let yourself do that. But then get over it and join the crowd, because unfortunately this applies to most people in the world today, and move on with your life. And as my talk is entitled, Get Ready, the World is Waiting. And I will say this, the world is waiting for as many people who are ready to embrace their adulthood and take on these responsibilities that we have as adults, because that's what the world is really going to need, is people who know how to take care of themselves, who have helped themselves grow up, maybe with a little help from their friends along the way, but who are also unconditionally loving themselves and capable of loving other people in the world as well. So I invite you to get ready, because the world is waiting.